Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's conversation on negotiation strategies for women with Dr. Ruchi Sinha. This is such an important conversation to have because I'm sure you've seen this for yourself in your own career. You need to be able to ask for what you want, ask for what you are worth. And if you don't, you do a great disservice to yourself.
Set yourself, value yourself, set a higher goal, ask for it. Persist through the negotiation.
Fortunately, there are effective strategies that you can use, and Dr. Ruchi Sinha breaks that down for us powerfully. Ruchi is an organizational psychologist and associate professor in the Leadership Management and Organization Department at Nanyang Business School in Singapore. With a PhD in organization psychology from Michigan State University, Dr. Sinha brings a unique blend of rigorous scientific frameworks and practical insights, as you will see and hear in this conversation. Her TED Talk on negotiation skills has over 3 million views. We have a lot to learn from her, so let's dive in. Welcome to the Conscious Woman podcast. This is your host, Bhavna Dhur. Our goal with this podcast is to bring you interesting and insightful conversations on a range of topics that will support you in both living and leading more consciously. From conscious leadership and conscious inclusion to conscious eating, conscious parenting, and conscious fashion. This podcast is in conjunction with the leadership development work that we do to support women leaders in leading with mindfulness and compassion. To learn more, please go to shenomics.com. Ruchi, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Bhavna.
Wonderful. Ruchi, if we can begin with perhaps defining negotiation, because I think so much of the resistance that at least I have seen in my work when it comes to negotiating perhaps has to do with how we define negotiation or how we view it. And I know you have a really beautiful and powerful way of looking at negotiation. So how would you define negotiation?
So you make a really good point, Bhavna, that when we say the word negotiation, it brings up a lot of memories of like buying, selling, competition, battle, it's going to be tough and it's going to be a conflict. The way I define it, and I tell a lot of my students the same thing, is think of it as any conversation, whether it's virtual or it's by email or it's in person, any conversation between two or more people where you're trying to find an agreement to help achieve your goal, their goal. And these goals are typically goals that cannot be achieved on your own. So think about where should we go for dinner tonight? And you are talking to your other half. That's a negotiation. Why? Because it's a conversation between two people. The goal is to go to dinner. The agreement is on where to go for dinner. People might have different interests, and you cannot decide alone where you want to go for dinner as a couple. So you have to be in that conversation. So that, to me, is a negotiation. Now, you can take that to apply to any conversation, any set of goals across industry domains of life.
Yes. Thank you so much for sharing that reframe on negotiation, because I think that when you describe it as more of a conversation, it just feels so much more approachable and doable, especially for us as women, because we do have, on average, we do shy away from negotiating, which brings me to my next question, Ruchi. Why do you think it's important for women to negotiate? What becomes possible if we do?
Yeah, so a lot of things. Let's, for a second, put the women frame aside and be like, why does being good at negotiation benefit all of us? It benefits us because we have less buyer's remorse, in the sense that we have less, what if I did it? What if it would have happened? And so we have more peace of mind. Peace of mind can come because you tried to have a conversation, not always because it went your way, right? So the resentment or the remorse often happens when you're like, what if I had? So for peace of mind, having the skill to negotiate is essential. For getting what you want, often what you think you deserve, you don't get till you have that conversation and reveal what it is that you think you deserve or want. So oftentimes, again, there's remorse, resentment, sadness about not being seen, not being given what is deserved. So to have peace of mind while going through life, you need this essential skill. Now, why do women need to practice and get some self-efficacy around this skill? Is because we know there's a gender pay gap. We know women are still minority in a lot of male-dominated industries, and a lot of industries are still male-dominated when it comes to positions of power and authority. So when you're looking for a promotion, a raise, or an opportunity to take up a leadership role, aligning your career to whatever you want, maybe opting out of work or negotiating a part-time job or, moving countries, which I'm in the middle of doing right now, negotiating benefits, wages, stability, security, independence, pay. All of this requires that conversation because you cannot achieve any of these goals on your own. And that is the definition. Anything you can't achieve on your own, for which you need an agreement with any other party, is a negotiation. So, yeah. And to last point, so peace of mind, getting what you value in all of these domains, but also building your own confidence about your own value. So it's an iterative process. We always hear to be confident, but our confidence comes from the feedback we get from the market, from the others. And these conversations and getting what you want or achieving to some extent what you want builds that confidence.
Yes, absolutely. I think that your last point about confidence is so true, because asking for what you want, as you said, at the end of the day is perhaps one of the most powerful ways in which we affirm our value, our self-worth. And if we are going to create a career that is aligned with what we most deeply value, it has to involve asking for what we want. And that involves negotiation. Now, coming back to confidence and for us to feel like we can do this with confidence, I'm curious to know, Ruchi, what has your work or what does research show in terms of what are some perhaps strengths or attributes that on average we may have as women that we can actually bring to the negotiating table to ensure success?
Yeah. So in order for me to answer that question, let's think back to what most women believe are their strengths. Okay. Now I'm saying this, what most women believe are their strengths, because everything I'm going to say doesn't apply to every woman, but as, let's say, a gender group, which is not binary, but we'll stick to that right now. The idea is that both evolutionarily and societally and culturally, women have grown to be better at empathy. Women have grown to become good perspective takers. They have a certain sense of warmth. They are often approachable, friendly, compassionate. They have survived through thousands of years of being women by collaborating, by building consensus, by, living in supportive, close group, cohesive environments. So all of these, again, this applies to in some ways a stereotype, but there are truth to these stereotypes, that women are communal, they're caregiving, nurturing, altruistic, empathetic. These are all strengths that you can bring to the table because they help to build trust. They help to build a sense of other orientation. So when people are having conversation with women, they can very much see that they care about the other party's interests, and that's a huge strength in a negotiation because you're already sort of reducing future conflict or future sort of dominance battle by being upfront in this warm, personable way. Now, what women could build on in terms of areas of growth are things that are typically considered agentic traits. So there's something called the gender congruity theory or the gender role theory that says typically women are expected to be all of these communal things, nurturing, empathetic, warm, and men in general, as a binary group, which it isn't, the masculinity shows up in things like being assertive, being competitive, being very sort of self-reliant, ambitious, and determined and decisive. And again, evolutionarily, historically, and culturally, men have had to take on roles and the culture has demanded them to show these characteristics. So for most men, not all, these come out more naturally. And these are the areas of growth for women because, again, the history, the evolution, and the culture has put pressure to subdue these things, even if they exist in women, do not let it show.
Yeah, that differentiation is definitely an interesting one, as you said, between communal values and agentic in terms of, as a society, what we expect of the different genders and specifically how we expect women to show up in situations. I'm curious, Ruchi, if when we look at the positives that you laid out, that women are empathetic, they're warm, they're perceived as warm, they bring all these communal traits with them. I'm wondering if that can also become an impediment of sorts for women, if that can actually backfire. What I mean is, typically in a negotiation, what happens is, and this is, again, it's a stereotype, because women are perceived to show up as empathetic and communal, when women start displaying these more agentic values, as you said, where they're asking for what they want, they're being more assertive, it can sometimes be perceived in a negative light. And instead of assertive, they're seen as aggressive or, perhaps crossing the boundary in some sense. And it's that legitimate fear that women have that there will be a backlash as a result of that, which sometimes holds us back from negotiating in the first place. So I'm curious, do you feel there is a negative to women negotiating, and how do we navigate that?
Yeah. So I think what you mentioned is definitely true. There's a lot of evidence through scientific research, through narrative analysis of people's lived experiences and the consequences of showing agentic traits. And there's a lovely book by Susan Faludi that talks about backlash. And since then, over the last 15 years, lots of research has shown that there are social penalties for women who contradict their communal stereotype by showing assertiveness. There are many words we've used for this social penalty. We've called it social backlash. And the penalty and the backlash is the word that tells you that there is some punishment waiting for you if you show these agentic traits. And that punishment typically takes the form of not being liked. So what is happening is you're supposed to be, as a woman, stereotypically communal. So you're supposed to be nice, agreeable, caring, not selfish, not asking for what you want, but thinking about what others might want because you're empathetic. So the minute you assert or show decisiveness or ambition or determined attitude, it starts sounding like, oh, you are not as feminine as I expected you to be in these traits, and therefore you're not warm. Therefore, you're not caring. Therefore, you're not nurturing. So I don't really like you. So there are a lot of B words used, like you said, aggression, bossy, and we won't use the others, but there are some very derogatory terms for women who act in agentic ways. Now, if you just look at the evidence, what are women to do? They're in like what we call a double bind. You need to show assertiveness. You need to show determined ambition. Otherwise, you're never going to get promoted. No one's going to value you. And actually, research evidence shows that people are seen as less competent when they're not assertive, or when they're not determined, or when they're not showing these agentic, self-reliant, competitiveness, decisiveness. You need this to be seen as competent. The minute you show them, you are actually seen as competent. Women get promoted because of these agentic traits, but they're not liked. Now, is it important to be liked? Absolutely. Liking is very closely related to trust. It's very closely related to how you gather information in organization, who comes to you for advice. So you might grow by showing agentic traits as a woman up to a certain point, and the lack of likability is going to make your career plateau because you need both. You need competence and likability and warmth to grow. So I'm not painting a very positive picture here, but I do want to make one very important point is for a very long time, women were blamed for not negotiating. There were books written on women don't ask. And, you know, the Sheryl Sandbergs of the type, like, you need to just lean in and be this kind of man that the world needs you to be, or, you know, you need to show these traits. Just learn how to be assertive, aspirational, and go out there and ask, and then all your problems will be solved. During that same period, there's all this evidence that if you do that, you get punished.
Right.
Right? So are these women being rational by not asking because they know through evidence and lived experience that it's going to hurt them? Yes. And in 2024, in February, there's been a massive review of literature for the last decade. And the narrative that women don't ask is no longer true, in the sense that there are many categories of women who are now in their late 20s who have grown up hearing this idea that women need to be assertive, women need to be aspirational. They have started asking. Mm-hmm. So in a recent study, I think it was the Linda Babcock, actually the person who wrote that Women Don't Ask book, just recently this research paper came out that's saying amongst at least MBA, women in MBA organizations, earlier the studies used to show that MBA graduates, men and women, differed in what they asked during their salary negotiations on-campus recruitment. In the last 15 years, women and men are asking the same amount of times. They're initiating the negotiations the same amount of time, yet there's a gender pay gap. That means there are more structural reasons and other reasons why women are getting lower pay. It's not just that they didn't ask. So, and I can go into sort of the complications of why that happens, but I'll stop there for a moment.
Yeah, I'm so glad you are busting this myth, because there is this perception that if women aren't getting more, or if there is this pay gap, it's because women aren't negotiating. So for you to share this research with us, it's quite actually reassuring that actually women are, they're doing their part. We're doing our part. We're asking for what we want, but there's still apparently these structural reasons because of which we're not getting more of what we want. And I'd love for you to actually touch upon some of this. So what is still getting in the way?
Yeah, so the recent data is showing that women are negotiating as much and sometimes even more than men. Because think about trying to compensate, knowing these are educated, well-trained, people who are, experienced, getting the MBAs or executive MBAs. So they know that it's important to ask. And so they're doing it frequently as men and more. So that data has changed. So believing that the backlash has changed is not true, right? So women have started asking. Yes, there was evidence for a very long time that women were less likely to initiate negotiations. They used to set lower targets. They were less aspirational. That might be true for a whole host of women even today. But let's say after years and years of these advice that, hey, try and initiate a conversation. Set yourself, value yourself, set a higher goal, ask for it, persist through the negotiation. There's now data showing that women have started doing those 3 steps. All right. Now, what may be the structural barriers that may prevent women despite these efforts is that we know that their first offers made to women by employers are lower than the first offer made by men. Right? So it matters from the base from which you start negotiating, right? So you might be a really good negotiator, but you started from a lower first offer, right? So that's a structural barrier in the sense that someone else is biasing you or punishing you by starting low. There There are other structural myths, like there are no equitable policies. A lot of these pay negotiations, especially in the US and in a lot of countries, even in Singapore and other countries, these are ideals. They're called idiosyncratic deals, right? No one knows how much anyone makes at that level. The pay range is not made visible. Now, these are poor structural policies because the minute you make the pay range not visible and transparent, you have more chances of gender pay gap and more chances of biases coming in. So we know that women, when they know the lower and the higher range, tend to be aspirational. But when the range is not known, they don't know where to set their aspiration. Because where do they get their aspirations? From other people. Who are these other people they're likely to be with? Their friends, likely to be other women who may share their salary ranges for similar role. So not having information is a structural issue. You cannot blame the women. If that's not being made available, women can't know where to set aspirations. And because they are more sort of giving, they underestimate themselves. They sometimes start in the middle of that range, while men overestimate often, again, stereotypically, and start higher. So even when they don't know the range, they land pretty high. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. So if that range has not been provided, there's no transparency around that, is that a fair question to ask? That can you please share with me what might be the range for this position? Is there a backlash to asking that?
I think there are lots of questions. Questioning in general is a good strategy in negotiation because the purpose is to gather information. I think believing that the same employers in the same societies and industries where they are purposefully not making the range known are going to be upfront with that information when you ask it so directly is just less likely. Because they have been socialized to hide that information and to see that information as an advantage to the recruiter, right? So think of it, the other person on the other side also doesn't want you to know the range, because knowing the range means you know the zone of where the agreement might fall, right? So one way to get that information is to obviously use a lot of objective research. So using places like Glassdoor, using network of women that you are part of, where I can give you my own story as an academic negotiating for jobs in countries where the range is not given for an academic position. We have an anonymous Google sheet where all of us, whenever we get good, high, top-end faculty jobs or any range of faculty jobs, we reveal our salaries on that Google document. So everyone knows what they're getting paid so that we have that information. So there are affinity groups through which you can collect. But what you have to do is basically go in with a possible, probable range and exaggerate it a little bit, obviously towards the side you want to go, to the extent you can justify that you are deserving of that, and check, maybe then, could this be the range? Because then the range information is coming from you. They are more likely to agree or disagree. The recruiter might also just, try and avoid this whole conversation and just go somewhere else with it. But if you say that this is what I have done from my industry research, you've already established credibility that this should be the range, right? So if they say, no, I'm not telling you what the range is, and they deny that this is the range, then you can ask, well, this is based on the research of other people's roles, right? So then they might give you an explanation as to why their range is different, and that'll give you information.
All right. So it has a lot to do with preparation, your research, and the kinds of questions you can ask to uncover this information indirectly, if not directly.
Yeah. And just Bhavna on that, everyone knows they need to plan and do research, right? Everyone knows intuitively. But we need to know that our ways of doing research can be biased. We seek information that confirms our expectation. So if we're going in feeling not deserving of a salary, we are going to pay attention to those friends who've got lower salaries and justify ourselves to ask for lower because we are fearful. We will not extend our social network to include strangers and other men who are very different from us or women who are very different from us who've negotiated. Why? Because they might not be close to us. So we don't ask those questions. So when you do research, before you decide that the data that you've collected is objectively accurate in terms of range, you really need to understand your emotional biases and your cognitive biases. So women especially need to put an extra effort to go and search for both sides of the spectrum.
Yeah, absolutely. So step one, as you said, is challenging yourself to have these conversations. So you have all the relevant data points, you've done your research.
Mm-hmm.
What would be the next step for women in this scenario? Let's say it is a salary negotiation. How do you ensure that conversation itself goes well? And tying back to what you said earlier about how one of the ways as women for us to walk that fine line, that double bind, is we want to be mindful of balancing both that sense of competence and that warmth in a situation like this. So in a salary conversation, how do we do this fine dance and play with those attributes?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. There's a lot been written on this idea of sugar and spice. Some of my co-authors, Carol Kulik and Mara Olipkin, have written a whole book chapter on using relational accounts to make your ask. So before I go into that communal and agentic dance and how to show that in a conversation, let me step back one step and say that when women are starting, let's say, a salary promotion or a leadership opportunity negotiation, you've done that research we talked about. You've objectively got the range. Now, the other thing you have to do is manage your emotions before you get into those conversations, right? I have a whole TED talk on emotional distancing, on defensive pessimism. The point of the conversation is not to know for sure you will get what you want. It is to start the process of making decisions to reach an agreement. So being prepared to hear a no and knowing what you will do when you get a no is a great way of reducing fear and anxiety. Second, to remind yourself that what you're asking for is deserving to you. Now, when women find it difficult to feel that they have value or a higher salary is deserving, an amazing way that works, as sad as it is think about not yourself, but think about how this could help other people, like your family, your dog, your parents, your husband, your partner, your friends, or how you could be a role model for the next generation of women working in your organization, or you could be a role model for your daughter. So when you shift the focus from I'm doing this for myself to I am doing this for many other things in my life, you'd be surprised women become more aspirational. They don't have the same fear and hesitancy. In fact, they have as aspirational as men. Why? Because then they don't feel selfish, right? They feel like they're approaching this conversation for someone else. So they are aligned with their own stereotype of being nice. Now, this is a trick. Yeah. But you can do this trick, and it is a true trick in the sense that it is true to your psychology, right? So we've got the emotions managed through planning, through some self-talk about you deserve this, not just for yourself, but for other reasons. Now you're in this conversation. Now, in that conversation, you have to use exactly these two pre-steps. You have to anchor the conversation on high aspirational goals. So your research will give you the range. The range will give you the top part of the range and gives you the ability to then anchor or ask for something slightly above the top or close to that absolute top. You want some scope to come down to the final offer, right? So that is called setting an aspirational target. So women need to do that. Now, doing that is what? It's agentic. It's assertiveness. It's being determined, ambitious. Now, if you just did that and asked for it, what is going to happen? The person in front of you is not going to like you, right? Because they think you're too competitive, too bossy, too aggressive, think too much of yourself. You're so selfish and all of these things. That's when you sprinkle some sugar on it. That sprinkling the sugar is all the communal stuff. So the minute you make an aspirational assertive ask, you follow that up with why, and that why is for others. That why is for helping the recruiter. So showing empathy, perspective taking, nurturing, caring, warmth, personable, approachable. I want this because this will help my team. I want this because I think this is an important project for your company, our company. And if I have this resource, I will be able to execute the goal towards your strategy. So when your explanation for your ask is other focus, that's when the communal traits show. And that's the dance you have to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's leveraging both traits to your advantage.
Mm-hmm.
So that I can see how that would be quite effective. What next? So let's say you've had this conversation and perhaps it's not going in the direction you would want. How do you what are some other variables one can play with to ensure you're still creating or working towards a win-win outcome?
Yeah. So there are lots of there's a lot of research done by negotiation scholars on turn taking, on how you sort of move the conversation when it derails or when you get too much resistance. So there are lots of moves that an employer could make that are not very warm, personable, caring, and interested in helping you, right? So they could just be like, are you serious? There's no way I'm paying you that much. Or they might demean you by saying like, oh, you're just not experienced enough. You don't have the skills. I don't see how you can get an above average. So there can be a lot of sort of attacks or subtle sarcasm or direct or just ignoring or avoiding. All of these things you have to be prepared for, right? If you heard me say all this right now and it made you feel fearful, you could anticipate that fear early on. Remember to expect this. Remember to have defensive pessimism, to expect these things, and then prep yourself to level the playing field, to calling out some of these moves in subtle ways without necessarily making it worse. So, for example, if someone says, you just don't have the skills, you're not experienced enough, what do you need at that point? You can't argue with them. No, I am. How is it that I'm not? This is where doing that research comes handy. You're like, all right, so I understand where you're coming from and what you might think about skills, but here's something I know. People with about 6 to 8 years of experience who have an MBA or who have this certification or this degree, and I have worked in 3 different industries, taken all these kind of roles, and the average standard industry qualification is actually lower for an average salary for this role, right? I'm just wondering why you think my skills are not up to this industry standard. So you put the question back at them. But what have you done? Before you put the question back at them, you correct this misconception, right? So then their arguments can't just be an opinion. I don't think you're experienced. They too have to then provide. So that's one way of sort of leveling the thing. Another way is when people sort of make sly comments, be like, oh my God, you must think you're the queen, or wow, you're getting upset. I mean, did you really think I was going to pay you that much? Like something like that. You refocus on the problem, take a break, change the thing. So you could be like, I can see that this conversation, is getting a little bit personal. Can we refocus for a moment on the ask, which is around the compensation, not the way I am? And maybe we could take a break or come back or set up another time. So these are all turn taking. These are all moves where you have to not get, if you're getting offended, if your emotions are beyond your control, you have to stop the conversation and come back, because you are not capable of then being rationally managing warmth and competence. Because if you're upset, your warmth's going to go down. And your assertiveness, competition is going to go up. And then what's going to happen when you do that? You're going to be liked less, then their warmth is going to go down, and then that's a downward spiral. right? So these are just some ways. There are many other ways of like using we words. So instead of I, can we take a step back? Can we rely on industry standards while we make arguments, or, they're putting the question back. What do you think is a solution to this huge gap we have between what I want and what you think I deserve? Right.
I'm curious if this is what you refer to as co-creating and understanding with the person you are in a conversation with, because if there is a breakdown of alignment, I think what you're sharing right now is how to realign by creating this collaborative approach where you are collectively with the other person trying to figure out a solution that can work. So if the person in front of you is saying, I don't believe you have the skills right now, maybe it is about, okay, well, what are the skills? Where do you feel the gaps are? Or what are the additional skills you think I would need to get to this next level? And can we co-create a plan or some kind of an approach that we can collectively design to that end?
Absolutely. So, I know what you're referring to is the TEDx talk where I talk about understanding. It truly is that. So understanding the word understand is to stay among and between multiple ideas. That is the meaning of under and stand. Stand is Dutch and under is actually a Sanskrit word for within. So within and among ideas. So to understand someone or to build an understanding in the mind of the other, you have to continuously bring different paths, options, one way to get to the goal, another way to get to the goal. Whenever you get that no, you have to learn to engage in a conversation, which means when someone says no or cannot or not possible, the quick question is called a participative move is what will it take to make it a yes, right? At that moment, what you've done is I've accepted the no from you. I'm not arguing, but what will it take? When there's sticking points, you have to think about these counter moves, when someone says something that is untrue or dishonest or just not objectively correct, you can say, I'm puzzled. Can you explain where this comes from? Or, you can sort of divert your attention from personal things, be like, okay, I think we are in two ends of the spectrum. What solution would you suggest? Can you tell me why and why not are we considering this solution? These are all styles of questioning, clarifying, interrupting, puzzling, participation. And these are the things that I often teach my students for weeks in a classroom, because how do you use them? How much you practice them, how much you build your own confidence can make you a hell of a great negotiator.
Wonderful. So we've talked about some really powerful strategies women can use when you're inside an organizational setup. I'd also love to hear your thoughts on if entrepreneurs or freelancers should be doing anything differently. You now increasingly have women taking on freelance, these kinds of gigs where now you are in a business setup and you're negotiating as an entrepreneur. I'm curious, Ruchi, are there any do's or don'ts that entrepreneurs should be keeping in mind when they're negotiating with a client, let's say?
Yeah, I think it depends on what stage of being an entrepreneur you are. Now, I think typically an entrepreneur or a freelancer has chosen to take on a lot of risk because they already have confidence in either the product, service, or the entity that they are starting with, right? So they are in many ways starting from a place of confidence, or else they wouldn't have taken that step. Now, they might have had some validation of that confidence through funding, support, and initial clients, and some may not have had those validation. So again, reminding yourself, knowing your value, that you might have remembered when you started as an entrepreneur, but maybe 6 months into not doing too well or doing very well, you might have overconfidence or underconfidence, right? So my first thing is entrepreneurs are different because their confidence doesn't come from industry standards. They don't necessarily have other colleagues doing the exact same business from which they can set their mark about whether getting one client or 10 client is good or bad. It has to come from knowing your own skill, experience, and the quality of your product and service. So there's slight difference there. A lot of times I have friends, and my own husband was entrepreneur for 2 years and I was the supporting partner. I can tell you that the world has too many ideal Elon Musk type prototypes of being an entrepreneur, which actually lowers most people's confidence. So again, do the range of entrepreneurs, know the failures and the successes and the middle ones to set your aspiration. The second thing is to really do a lot of research on your objectives and aspirations, whether it's pricing your service, the timeline, the specific delivery. You really need to break down your negotiation into these small issues. And for each of those issues, you really have to think about what's feasible, not just what's good for the client, right? Because usually it's a resource gap that the demands cannot be met for entrepreneurs. So, and that is where entrepreneurs often build trust. So if you're an established big company, there's no need to build trust on your capacity to deliver. When you're a small start-off entrepreneur, it is your capacity that you have to build trust in. So your unique skill, time, resources. So I would say that's one big difference. Obviously, almost every negotiation requires building a rapport, building that trust. Trust builds differently when you have no track record or you're a young entrepreneur, young in the company sense. And I think the one other thing is you as an entrepreneur must know when to walk away and say no. Because of the position of desperation that you come from, oftentimes, you don't even articulate to yourself the possibility of saying no. And you have to, because sometimes a bad deal can set you up for many other future bad deals. So saying yes to a bad deal today. So know where that walk away point is. And there are lots of techniques for doing that, but know your walk away point.
Yes. And to your point about if you are, let's say, earlier in that life cycle and you are first still establishing trust in your capacity to deliver. So let's say you're beyond that point and you have proven your capacity to deliver. At that point, what would you say, how can one ask for more? Because now you have proven you can create value. What would be an effective way to be able to negotiate a higher contract at that point?
Yeah, so typically when, again, in the courses that I teach on negotiation skills for a lot of executives and entrepreneurs, I've got lots of students who are entrepreneurs. When you up your value in terms of the services you provide or the scope of the work that you're ready to give, you can build contingencies into your contract, right? So sometimes you need the foot in the door. So you do the sort of bread and butter contract. But with the bread and butter contract, on both sides, it's bread and butter being served and eaten. You want to serve cake eventually. And you decide what type of cake, under what circumstance would the client ready to accept and ready to pay for, right? So you again have to negotiate incrementally. You have to break down your product and services into base, level 1 or level 2, and level 1 should have a trigger point, and that's called a contingency contract. If X, Y, and Z is met, then automatically we'll go from bread and butter to cake, and then from cake to like creme brulee or whatever. I don't know if it depends on whether you prefer creme brulee over cake. But yeah, so I think contingency contract too. And when you promise a contingency contract upfront as a newbie, you're actually showing the client that you have confidence in yourself to deliver at a higher level. However, you're not making that promises without proving yourself on the bread and butter first. So there's actually more trust because the client feels less risk in agreeing to a higher value contract or a higher rate till they have had the time to see you in probation in many ways, a cheap probation, right? So that's a really good strategy in that case.
Yeah, wonderful. So before I ask you my final question, Ruchi, you've shared so many helpful tips on in this conversation for any woman who is listening to this and she wants to take any of these insights and start converting it into actual action that can help her, what would be a small starting point that you would recommend people use to begin with? What's one small action item anyone can take from this conversation?
The small action items, I feel like I've only shared the big, massive ones. The small action item is to maybe write a journal. Maybe write a journal after you've heard this podcast and our conversation. Where do you sit in that spectrum of agentic and communal? What are fears associated with expression of these attributes in your behavior and actions, voice, emotions? What are some of those fears? So journal some of these questions, reflect a bit on them, and then apply the strategies, because then you know where you sit on this spectrum and what your internal sort of what's holding you back. What are your gremlins that are holding you back, your fears? And then you can come up with solutions one at a time.
Yeah, that's great, because it's a great way to build self-awareness as well. And that has to be a powerful starting point for any negotiation. Mm-hmm. Now, coming to my final question. So a lot of the work that we do at Genomics when we talk about conscious leadership is about being conscious of the values that you are living and leading with. And that I know that applies just as much to a negotiation conversation as well. So I'd love to know, Ruchi, what for you are those values that you're very intentionally trying to cultivate or express a negotiation conversation?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. It makes me reflect a bit about what those values are. I'm not sure I'll call them all values, but they are inherently part of who I am. And I think to that extent, they are driving forces for all my behaviors and thinking. And my first one is just curiosity, like just being inquisitive about why not? What would it be like if I did it, or if I didn't, or I tried, or coming up with something? So, and it's also applied to seeking knowledge. I'm just curious, what's the range of this? Where does this career take me? Where does this step take me? What could happen? Counterfactual. What if I did this? So I think that curiosity makes me, I'm driven by that. So I don't fear the outcome. I don't fear at the end of the curious rendezvous endeavor that I may or may not get somewhere that I wanted to, because it's where I wanted to was the process of figuring it out. Right. So I think that is a really big enabler for me, because it reduces fear. So it's curiosity for the sake of curiosity. And in the end, good things happen sometimes. So I think that's like my first one. And the second one is very related to it. It's continuous learning. I don't see one negotiation as the end all be all, right? Like it's continuous learning. If I don't put myself in a certain situation outside my comfort zone, I won't learn what my comforts and fears are. And if I've just gotten that out of a conversation, learned my comforts, fears, and practice, that is goal achieved for me. And that, again, allows me to go into a conversation without hanging everything on the yes and the no. It allows me to go into a conversation with the aim that no matter what the other person does, I'm going to gain, right? So I think those are two things that I've applied to every domain of my life, whether it's moving to a new country, starting a new role. I am doing my first stand-up comedy routine tonight, and I have never thought I would stand up in front of 50, 20, 80 strangers at a comedy show and do my 5 minutes of stand-up comedy. I am freaking out right now because tonight I'm performing for the first time. But hey, I've already learned so much from the process of trying to do this. So I think sometimes I would equate like a negotiation as like doing stand-up comedy for the first time in your life. You're going to kill it or bomb it. It doesn't matter. You're going to learn something from it. So.
Yes, and if one applies these values that you just shared of curiosity and continuous learning, you will definitely learn and grow from the experience. So you will, in a sense, still come out ahead, irrespective of what the outcome is.
Absolutely. And I don't have to decide right now whether I ever want to be a comedian or not. I don't have to label myself as a comedian. I am doing this tonight. We will see. And who knows, maybe it's just the audience who doesn't get my sense of humor. But the point is that, or I just decide this is not for me, but I am not doing this because there is a set goal. And if I fail tonight, it is not going to make me a worse person or less skilled. If I succeed tonight, also doesn't mean that I'm set up to leave my academic job and become a comedian, but something will be gained in that process. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Ruchi, thank you so much. This conversation has been just chock full of insights and powerful strategies that I think any of us can use. And I love that you've broken it down for us in a way that makes it a lot more approachable, a lot more doable, and a lot more of a journey of learning about yourself and growing through the process, which is ultimately what conscious living and leadership is about as well. So thank you so much. All the best for your stand-up routine as well. I can't wait to hear all about it. And thank you for the wonderful work that you're doing.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Bhavna. And like all your questions have been very sort of, like I said, helped me think through a lot of the things I often teach and, give talks on. But in these conversations, you also get self-reflective. So I guess you've helped me to be a little more confident for my stand-up routine tonight. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. I hope you found the conversation to be insightful. If you did, please do leave us a review, as that would be most helpful in helping others discover this podcast as well. To learn more about the work that we do, please go to shenomics.com. We look forward to having you tune in again for future episodes. Until then, may you be well, may you be happy, and may you be at peace.